It had been a long day at work, the kind that left me longing for a quiet evening at home. As I pulled into our driveway, I noticed the porch light casting a warm glow across our front yard. For a moment, I let myself relax, imagining Emily inside, cooking dinner or reading one of her mystery novels. But as I got out of the car, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Emily wasn't alone. She was sitting on the porch swing, leaning forward with a tense expression, deep in conversation with a man I hadn't seen in years, Jason Miller. He hadn't changed much, still broad-shouldered with a confident smirk that always grated on my nerves. Seeing him here on our porch made something cold twist in my gut. I tried to keep my expression neutral as I approached, but Emily's shoulders tensed when she noticed me. She straightened, her smile a little too quick, a little too forced. "Ryan, you're home earlier than I thought." Jason turned, flashing me a grin that was all teeth. "Long time no see, Ryan. You look good. It's been, 5 years?" "Something like that," I said, keeping my voice even. "I didn't realize you were back in town." He shrugged like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Yeah, just got in a couple of weeks ago. Thought I'd look up some old friends, catch up on what I've missed." He glanced at Emily, a shadow passing over his expression before he turned back to me. "Hope you don't mind me dropping by." Emily shifted uncomfortably on the swing, and I couldn't help but notice the way she kept her hands clasped tightly in her lap, like she was holding something back. I forced a smile, nodding toward the door. "Why don't we all head inside? It's getting chilly out here." Jason shook his head, the smirk never leaving his face. "Thanks, but I should be going. Got a lot to do. Just wanted to stop by and say hi to an old friend." He turned to Emily, adding in a tone that felt just a little too pointed. "We'll finish our chat another time." With that, he walked down the steps and disappeared into the darkness. I watched him go, my mind buzzing with questions. When I turned back to Emily, she was already heading inside, her shoulders hunched like she was trying to retreat into herself. Inside, Emily went straight to the kitchen, busying herself with dinner prep. I followed, leaning against the counter, watching her as she chopped vegetables with a little too much focus. "So, Jason's back in town. That's a surprise." She kept her eyes on the cutting board, her movements brisk. "Yeah, he got in touch a few days ago. Just wanted to catch up." I tried to keep my voice light. "You never mentioned it." She paused, just for a moment, then shrugged. "I didn't think it was important. He's an old friend, that's all." Her tone was casual, but I knew Emily too well. There was a tightness in her voice that told me she was hiding something. I studied her for a moment, trying to read the expression on her face. But she kept her gaze fixed on the vegetables, her knife moving rhythmically up and down. "Must be nice to reconnect after all these years," I said, testing the waters. She glanced up at me, forcing a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, it's nice." But her voice faltered on the last word, and she turned away quickly, dumping the chopped vegetables into a pot on the stove. I watched her for a moment longer, wondering what she wasn't telling me. But I knew better than to push. Emily could shut down tighter than a vault when she felt cornered, and I wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. That night, I lay awake long after Emily had fallen asleep beside me. My thoughts kept drifting back to Jason's smirk, the way he looked at Emily like they shared some private joke. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that there was a hidden thread weaving through the tension between them. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could and headed downstairs, grabbing my laptop from the kitchen counter. I hesitated for a moment, then opened a search engine and typed in Jason's name. Most of what I found was old, mentions of his brief stint in real estate, a few photos of him at local charity events from years ago. Nothing recent, nothing that explained why he'd suddenly reappeared in our lives. Frustrated, I shut the laptop and leaned back in my chair, staring out into the darkened kitchen. My mind kept circling back to what Jason had said on the porch. "I've come back to settle some unfinished business." There was a threat hidden in those words. I was sure of it. But whether that threat was aimed at Emily or at me, I couldn't be certain. The next morning, I woke to find Emily already up, making coffee in the kitchen. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm meeting a client today after work, so I might be home late." I nodded, trying to ignore the knot tightening in my chest. "Another tough case?" She nodded, taking a sip of her coffee, her gaze distant. Yeah, it's been draining lately. I wanted to ask her if she was really meeting a client or if she was planning to see Jason again. But I bit back the question, knowing it would only make things worse. Instead, I kissed her on the cheek, trying to ignore the way she flinched at the touch, like she was already a million miles away. That evening, I came home to an empty house. Emily's car wasn't in the driveway, and the living room felt colder without her in it. I wandered through the house, trying to distract myself with chores, but my mind kept drifting back to her conversation with Jason, the way she'd avoided my questions. By the time it was dark, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket, got in the car, and drove through the winding streets of our small town, tracing the route I'd seen Emily take so many times on her client visits. I didn't have to look for long. I found her car parked outside a diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place we'd never have chosen for a date. My stomach twisted as I pulled over a few spots away, keeping my headlights off. Through the diner's window, I could see Emily sitting in a booth, leaning across the table toward Jason. He was speaking, his expression serious, but I couldn't hear what he was saying from where I sat. Emily's face was tense, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup as she listened. I snapped a few photos with my phone, feeling a pang of guilt at the intrusion, but telling myself that I needed to know the truth. When Jason leaned closer, resting his hand on hers, my chest tightened with something I couldn't quite name: fear, anger, jealousy. I forced myself to stay in the car, to watch as Emily pulled her hand away, her expression strained. She glanced around the diner, as if checking to make sure no one was watching, and I ducked down in my seat. They talked for a few more minutes before Jason got up, slipping out of the booth and heading toward the back exit of the diner. Emily stayed behind, burying her face in her hands for a moment before following him outside. My mind raced with questions. What were they talking about? Why had she lied about meeting a client? I waited a few minutes, then drove home, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. When Emily came in an hour later, she looked tired, her smile brittle as she kissed me goodnight. I pretended to believe her story about the difficult client, but inside, something had shifted. I knew that I couldn't let this go. I needed to find out what was really going on between her and Jason, and why he'd suddenly decided to come back into our lives. As I lay awake in bed that night, listening to Emily's steady breathing beside me, I made a decision. If she wasn't going to tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. And if that meant dragging old secrets into the light, so be it. I woke up the next morning with a new resolve. The memory of Emily's tense conversation with Jason still fresh in my mind. She was already out the door before I even got up, her coffee cup rinsed clean and left on the counter like a ghost of her presence. I told myself that I'd find answers today, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into a darkness I wasn't ready for. After breakfast, I made a few calls to old friends, people who'd known Emily before she and I got together. We had mutual connections from back when she was starting out as a social worker, but most of them hadn't kept in touch. Still, a few remembered Jason, mentioning that he and Emily used to be close, though no one seemed to know what had caused their rift. There were hints, though, mentions of a troubled kid they'd tried to help together, a case that had gone wrong. The more I dug, the more the pieces began to fall into place, though none of it made sense yet. It was clear that Jason and Emily had shared something significant, something tied to their work. And if Jason was using that against her now, I had to find out why. I decided to visit the local library, hoping to find records or old newspaper articles about the case that might give me a lead. As I scrolled through digitized archives on one of the library computers, my pulse quickened when I came across an article from nearly a decade ago. It was about a boy named Lucas Hill, 16 years old, a troubled kid who'd gone missing after running away from his abusive father. The article mentioned that Lucas had been in and out of the foster care system, and that a social worker named Emily Foster, my Emily before we got married, had been trying to help him. His disappearance had sparked a small wave of concern in the community, but he was found weeks later, drowned in a river miles away from town. The police had ruled it as an accident, a tragic end to a runaway story. But that wasn't what caught my attention. The article also mentioned a volunteer who'd been working with Emily on the case, someone who had been particularly close to Lucas, Jason Miller. I read the article again, my mind racing, This was what Emily had never told me, the connection between her and Jason that she'd tried to bury. And if Jason was threatening to bring it all back up now, there had to be more to the story than a tragic accident. That evening, when Emily got home, she seemed distracted, her eyes distant as she told me about her client meeting. I forced myself to nod, pretending to believe her story, but my mind was elsewhere, circling around the questions I still didn't have answers for. I waited until she went to bed, then crept down to the garage, where we kept some old boxes of her things from before we moved in together. Digging through dusty photo albums and faded keepsakes, I finally found what I was looking for, an old journal, the cover worn and creased, with Emily's handwriting scrawled across the first page. I hesitated, feeling a pang of guilt for invading her privacy. But then I thought of Jason, of the way he'd spoken to her at the diner, and my resolve hardened. I needed to know the truth. The journal entries started innocently enough. Musings about her early days as a social worker, the challenges she faced with different kids. But then about halfway through, the entries shifted, becoming darker, more urgent. January 14th, Lucas ran away again. I tried talking to his father, but it's no use. The man's a monster, but there's nothing I can do if Lucas won't testify. Jason says we should do more, maybe try to get him out of town for a while, but I don't know if that's legal. I just want to keep him safe. January 27th. Jason is pushing me to go further, to help Lucas run away for good. He says it's the only way. I'm scared, but maybe he's right. Maybe this is the only way to save him. February 3rd. I can't believe what we've done. We put Lucas on that bus, but he never made it to the shelter. Jason thinks we should keep quiet, but I can't stop thinking about what will happen if they find out. My breath caught as I read the words. Emily and Jason hadn't just been helping Lucas. They tried to smuggle him out of town, to hide him from his father. But something had gone wrong, and now Jason was using it against her. I closed the journal, my hands shaking, and slipped it back into the box. My mind spun with the implications. If Jason had new evidence about what had happened, he could use it to ruin Emily's career, maybe even have her charged with some kind of crime. And whatever his real motive was, it was clear that he hadn't come back just to reconnect with old friends. The next day, I decided to visit Jason directly, hoping to confront him about what I'd found. I drove out to the motel where he was staying, a rundown place on the edge of town. Jason answered the door with a smirk, but when he saw the look on my face, his expression sobered. "Well, if it isn't the loyal husband," he said, stepping aside to let me in. The room smelled of stale smoke and old carpet, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of revulsion at how far he'd fallen since the days when we'd been friends. I got straight to the point. "I know about Lucas, Jason. I know what happened between you and Emily back then." He raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms as he leaned against the dresser. "Oh, do you now? And what exactly is it that you think you know?" "You're blackmailing her," I said, the words coming out harsher than I intended. "You're using whatever happened with Lucas to threaten her." "Why?" Jason chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "I'm not blackmailing anyone, Ryan. I'm giving Emily a chance to finally own up to what she did. You think she's the innocent one in all this? She's the one who put Lucas on that bus, who left him alone out there when things went south." His eyes gleamed with a twisted satisfaction, and I realized that he wasn't just trying to ruin Emily. He wanted her to suffer, to feel the weight of her own guilt. "You think you can scare me off, Jason?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not going to let you ruin her life." Jason's smirk faded, and he leaned closer, his expression turning cold. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about ruining anyone's life. It's about getting justice for that kid, for what she and I did to him. I've got new evidence, things that'll make people take a second look at that case. And if she doesn't help me with what I want, I'll take it to the police." "What do you want?" I demanded, feeling my frustration boil over. Jason's eyes flashed with something dark. "I want Emily to admit what she did, to own up to it publicly. And if she doesn't, well, then she and you can live with the consequences." I stared at him, trying to make sense of his words, but all I felt was a rising sense of dread. Jason was dangerous, unhinged even, and I realized that whatever he was planning, he wasn't going to back down easily. I left the motel, my hands clenched into fists, knowing that I'd stepped into something much deeper than I'd expected. Emily and Jason had made a mistake years ago, one that had festered into something toxic. And now, if I didn't find a way to stop him, it was going to drag all of us down. That night, I waited for Emily to come home, her expression weary as she stepped through the door. I couldn't hold back any longer. "I want to see Jason today," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. She froze, her face going pale, but she quickly forced a smile. "Why would you do that?" "Because I know about Lucas, Emily," I continued, my words coming out in a rush. "I know what happened, and I know he's using it to threaten you. But what I don't understand is why you're letting him." Her smile faltered, and for a moment, I thought she might break down, might finally tell me the full story. But then she took a deep breath, her expression hardening. "You don't understand, Ryan. You don't know what he's capable of." "Then tell me," I pressed, my frustration boiling over. "Tell me what really happened so I can help you." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and something else. Regret, maybe, or guilt. But then she shook her head, pulling away from me. "I can't. Just trust me, Ryan. Please." With that, she turned and walked upstairs, leaving me standing in the dimly lit living room, feeling more alone than ever. I knew she was hiding the full truth, but I also knew that whatever Jason was planning, it was only going to get worse. And as I stood there in the dark, I realized that if I wanted to protect her, I'd have to keep digging, even if it meant dragging every buried secret into the light. The air in the house had grown thick with silence, each moment between me and Emily charged with things left unsaid. I went through the motions of my daily routine, teaching classes, grading essays, trying to act like everything was fine. But my mind kept circling back to Lucas, to Jason's threats, to the way Emily seemed to fold in on herself whenever I mentioned Jason's name. It felt like our home had become a stage, and we were both actors pretending that our lives weren't collapsing around us. That evening, after Emily left for another client meeting, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my jacket and headed to the local bar where Jason had suggested he might be if I ever wanted to talk more. As much as I hated the idea of seeing him again, I needed to know what kind of leverage he really had over Emily and what he planned to do with it. When I arrived, I found Jason at the end of the bar, nursing a drink. The place was dimly lit, with a low hum of conversation filling the air. Jason looked up as I approached, his smirk slipping into something more guarded when he saw the grim look on my face. "Didn't think you'd actually show up," he said, taking a long sip from his glass. "What's the matter, Ryan? Trouble in paradise?" I ignored the jab and slid onto the bar stool beside him. "You said you have evidence. Something about what happened to Lucas. Show it to me." Jason chuckled, swirling the ice in his glass. "Straight to the point, huh? I always liked that about you, Ryan, but I'm afraid it's not that simple. See, the evidence isn't just something I can hand over. It's more complicated than that." I gritted my teeth, struggling to keep my frustration in check. "You keep throwing these cryptic threats around, but I haven't seen a shred of proof. If you've got something that implicates Emily, then show it to me. Otherwise, you're just blowing smoke." Jason's expression darkened, and he leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You think I'm bluffing? I've got witnesses, Ryan. People who saw Emily and me that night, who know about the bus ticket we bought for Lucas, about how we tried to hide him. And I've got letters he wrote to Emily before he disappeared, begging her to get him out of town. The kind of letters that might make the police take a second look at what really happened." He paused, his gaze hardening. "You think Emily's so innocent? She wanted to save that kid, sure, but when things got messy, she didn't know how to handle it. She panicked, and now she's trying to keep her hands clean while I'm left dealing with the fallout." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. If Jason was telling the truth, then Emily's involvement in Lucas's disappearance went far deeper than she'd let on. But there was something about Jason's tone, the way he seemed to relish twisting the knife, that made me doubt his story too. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "What do you want, Jason? Why are you doing this?" Jason's smile returned, colder than before. "I want Emily to finally own up to what she did, to admit that she made mistakes, that she didn't do everything she could to save him. And I want her to help me get back what I lost, my reputation, my standing in this town. If she won't, Then I'll make sure everyone knows what really happened." He leaned back, finishing his drink with a flourish. "You can't protect her forever, Ryan. Sooner or later, the truth will come out." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my anger in check. Part of me wanted to drag him out of the bar and beat the smug look off his face, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. I had to find another way, something that would keep him from turning his threats into reality. I stood up, throwing a few bills on the bar, and looked him in the eye. "Stay away from my wife, Jason. Whatever you think she did, I won't let you use it against her." He watched me go, his smirk never wavering, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I walked out into the cold night air. I knew that I hadn't heard the last of him, and I knew that the time for waiting was over. If Emily wouldn't tell me the full truth, I'd have to find it myself. When I got home, the house was dark, Emily's car still missing from the driveway. I headed back to the garage and dug out her old journal again, flipping through the pages until I found the last entries she'd written about Lucas. They were filled with worry and doubt, questions about whether they were doing the right thing, whether Lucas would be safer away from his father. But there was one entry that stood out, written a few days after Lucas had disappeared. February 10th. "Jason says we have to stick to the story, that it's better if no one knows how we tried to help Lucas get away. But I can't stop thinking about the look on his face when we left him at the bus stop. What if he never made it to the shelter? What if he went back home because he thought he'd be safer there? I keep seeing his father's face in my dreams, the way he smiled when the police told him they'd close the case. But if I tell anyone what really happened, it could ruin everything. I have to stay quiet. I have to." I read the entry again, the words sinking into my mind like lead weights. Emily had been afraid, even back then, afraid that speaking up would destroy the fragile life she'd built. But what haunted me more was the possibility that she'd lied to the police, that she'd covered up what happened to Lucas out of fear. I put the journal away and leaned back against the wall, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Jason had made it clear that he'd go to the police if Emily didn't give in to his demands. And if he had witnesses or letters, there was no telling what damage he could do. But I also knew that Jason had his own secrets, ones he was hiding even now. And that meant that if I wanted to save Emily, I'd have to take a risk. I'd have to confront her again, force her to tell me what really happened, and decide if she was worth protecting at all. Emily came home late that night, looking exhausted and on edge. She found me waiting for her in the living room, the journal in my hands. For a moment, she froze in the doorway, and I saw the fear in her eyes before she managed to hide it behind a tired smile. "What are you doing up so late?" she asked, slipping off her coat and draping it over the arm of the couch. "I thought you'd be asleep by now." I held up the journal, watching as her face went pale. "I found this in the garage, Emily. I know about Lucas. I know what you and Jason did." Her shoulders sagged, and she sank into the armchair across from me, burying her face in her hands. "I didn't want you to know," she whispered. "I didn't want you to see that part of me." I felt my anger flare up, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Why, Emily? Why did you keep this from me?" She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "Because I was scared, Ryan. Scared that if you knew what I'd done, you'd never look at me the same way again. Jason and we thought we were doing the right thing. We thought we could save Lucas, but everything went wrong. And when he died, we made a choice to keep quiet, to protect ourselves." Her voice cracked, and she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Jason's always blamed me for what happened. He said that if I'd pushed harder, if I'd convinced Lucas to stay away from his father, he might still be alive. And now he's come back to make me pay for it." I stared at her, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to believe her, to take her in my arms and promise that we'd get through this together. But another part of me couldn't ignore the fact that she'd lied to me for so long, that she'd made choices that I might never fully understand. "Jason says he has evidence," I said quietly. "Letters from Lucas, people who saw you that night. If he takes that to the police, they'll reopen the case. You could lose everything." Emily nodded, her face pale. "I know. That's why I need you, Ryan. I need you to help me make him stop." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settle over me. She was asking me to choose between the woman I loved and the truth I couldn't ignore. And as I looked into her eyes, I realized that no matter what I decided, there would be no going back. The next morning, I could barely focus on my classes. My mind was locked on my conversation with Emily, on the haunted look in her eyes when she had begged me to help her. Jason's threats, the journal's revelations, everything circled through my thoughts like a storm. By the end of the school day, I had made a decision, though it left a bitter taste in my mouth. If Jason was going to use his threats to tear our lives apart, then we needed leverage too. We couldn't just sit back and hope he'd change his mind. We had to force him into a corner, make him expose his true motives. And the only way to do that was to set a trap. When I got home, I found Emily sitting in the living room, staring out the window at the leafless trees swaying in the wind. She looked like she hadn't slept at all, her hair disheveled, dark circles under her eyes. When she saw me, she tried to smile, but it fell apart almost immediately. "Did you talk to him again?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, taking a seat across from her. "He thinks he has us cornered, but I have an idea, a way to turn the tables." She frowned, her expression wary. "What do you mean?" I leaned forward, lowering my voice, even though we were alone. "We record him, Emily. We get him on tape admitting that he's trying to blackmail you, that he's using whatever happened with Lucas to manipulate you. If we can catch him threatening you, we can use that as leverage." She hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. "What if he finds out? What if he turns it against us?" "That's a risk we'll have to take," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He's bluffing about going to the police. I'm sure of it. If he really had solid evidence, he would have used it by now. But we need to make him show his cards." Emily stared at me for a long moment, her expression torn between fear and hope. Finally, she nodded, a flicker of determination lighting in her eyes. "Okay, I'll do it. Just tell me what you need me to do." That evening, we rehearsed what Emily would say, going over the plan until we were both too exhausted to continue. I hid a small recording device in her purse, one that would automatically activate when she pressed a button hidden beneath the lining. The idea was simple. She would meet with Jason, pretend to be considering his demands, and try to push him into revealing his true intentions. Meanwhile, I would be nearby, listening from my phone and ready to intervene if things went south. It was a dangerous plan, and I could see the fear in Emily's eyes every time we talked about it. But there was something else there too, a flicker of trust, a willingness to let me in after all the secrets she had kept. And as much as I hated the position we were in, I couldn't deny that part of me was glad she was letting me help. We arranged the meeting for the following night, at the same diner where I'd seen them before. Emily texted Jason, telling him she needed to talk, that she was ready to make a deal. He agreed without hesitation, clearly eager to regain the upper hand. But I could tell from the tension in his replies that he didn't trust her any more than she trusted him. The stage was set, and now all we had to do was play our parts. The next night, I parked a few blocks away from the diner, watching as Emily's car pulled into the lot. She stepped out, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse to her side. I gave her a reassuring nod as she passed my car, then watched as she disappeared through the diner's entrance. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a warning bell. I picked up my phone, dialing into the audio feed from the recording device. For a moment, there was only static. Then I heard the murmur of voices and the clink of dishes. I held my breath as I heard Jason's voice, smooth and confident, like he knew he was in control. "Nice of you to come to your senses, Emily," he said. "I knew you'd realize that I'm your best option here. I don't have much of a choice, do I?" Emily replied, her voice wavering just enough to sound convincing. "You've made it pretty clear what'll happen if I don't cooperate." There was a pause, and I could almost see Jason smirk through the phone. "That's right, but it doesn't have to end badly. Help me with what I need, and I'll forget about Lucas. I'll make sure no one ever finds out what really happened." Emily hesitated, and I could hear the tremor in her voice. "And if I don't?" Jason's tone turned cold, the menace in his voice unmistakable. "Then I take everything to the police. I'll tell them how you covered up Lucas's death, how you let him go back to his father when he needed you the most. They'll eat that story up, and you'll lose everything. Your job, your marriage, your life." I clenched my fists, my grip on the phone tightening as I listened to his threats. It took everything I had not to storm into the diner right then, but I forced myself to stay put, to let the plan play out. Emily's voice cracked, the fear in her tone almost too real. Okay. Just give me some time to think about it. I can't make a decision like this overnight. Jason's response was sharp, cutting. You don't have time, Emily. If you want my silence, you need to decide now. Otherwise, I walk out of here and make some phone calls. There was a brief pause. Then I heard the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Jason's voice came back, softer but more threatening. I almost feel bad for you. You used to have such a bright future, such ambition. And now look at you, begging for scraps, trying to hold on to a life you don't deserve. I could hear the barely controlled anger in Emily's voice as she replied, her words cutting through the air like a blade. And what about you, Jason? What kind of man comes crawling back after all these years, trying to blackmail the people he once called friends? Jason let out a humorless laugh. A man who's tired of being forgotten. A man who wants what he's owed. I listened, my heart racing, knowing that we had enough. Jason had admitted to the blackmail, had threatened her outright. But as I prepared to signal Emily, I heard a shift in the background noise. A second chair scraping, footsteps moving toward the door. Panic seized me as I realized what was happening. Jason had noticed her recording device. I heard a scuffle, the sound of something falling to the floor. Then Jason's voice, low and dangerous. You really thought you could play me, didn't you? He hissed. Stupid girl. I threw open my car door, sprinting toward the diner's entrance. By the time I reached the door, Jason had Emily pinned against the wall, just inside the back hallway. One hand wrapped around her wrist, the other clutching the recording device he'd pulled from her purse. His head snapped up as he saw me, his eyes flashing with anger. So this was your plan, huh? Send your little wife to set me up? I moved toward him, forcing myself to stay calm. Let her go, Jason. It's over. We've got you on tape, and you know it. He tightened his grip on Emily's wrist, making her wince. You think this is over? You think a little recording is going to stop me? He glanced back at Emily, his expression twisting into something darker. Maybe it's time you learn that some mistakes can't be undone. Before I could react, Jason pulled a knife from his jacket, pressing it against Emily's throat. My heart leapt into my throat as I froze, my mind racing for a way out. I couldn't let him hurt her, but I also knew that if I made the wrong move, he might do something we couldn't take back. Emily's eyes locked onto mine, wide with fear, and I saw the tears brimming at the corners of her eyes. I took a deep breath, raising my hand slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. Jason, listen to me, I said, forcing myself to keep my tone calm. You don't have to do this. You don't want to hurt anyone. You just want to be heard. Let her go, and we can talk this through. I don't want to see you go down for this. For a moment, Jason seemed to waver, his grip on the knife loosening. But then he shook his head, the anger in his expression hardening. No, I'm done listening. I'm done being pushed around. I took a step closer, my hand still raised. Think about Lucas, Jason. Think about why you started this in the first place. He wouldn't want you to hurt anyone else. He wouldn't want. Before I could finish, Emily jerked her knee upward, catching Jason in the gut. He doubled over, dropping the knife, and I lunged forward, grabbing him by the shoulders and throwing him against the wall. He hit the floor with a thud, gasping for breath, the knife clattering away from his reach. Emily scrambled back, her face pale, and I moved between her and Jason, my chest heaving with adrenaline. I grabbed the recording device from the floor and slipped it into my pocket, my mind buzzing with the realization that we'd gotten what we needed, but at a cost I hadn't anticipated. Jason glared up at us, his lip bleeding where he'd bitten it during the struggle. You're making a mistake, Ryan. You think this ends here? I stared down at him, my fists clenched, but Emily touched my arm, her voice shaking. We need to go, Ryan. Now! I hesitated, then nodded, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the exit. We left Jason lying on the diner floor, the weight of what we'd just done pressing down on us like a physical force. The drive home was silent, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on both of us like a suffocating blanket. Emily kept her eyes fixed on the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. I held the recording device in my pocket, feeling the cool, solid reassurance of it. But it did little to calm the adrenaline still surging through my veins. As we pulled into our driveway, I turned to Emily, struggling to find the right words. "Are you okay?" I asked, knowing how inadequate it sounded after everything we'd just been through. She nodded, but there was a haunted look in her eyes that made my chest tighten. "I will be," she replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. "But Ryan, we need to talk about what happens next. If Jason goes to the police." "We have the recording," I interrupted, trying to sound confident, even though doubt gnawed at the edges of my mind. "He threatened you. We can use it to make him back off, to prove that he's the one who's been pushing this." Emily shook her head, her expression tightening with frustration. "It's not that simple. He still got those letters from Lucas, the witnesses. If he twists things, he could make it look like we were the ones trying to cover up what happened. We have to be smart about this." She was right, of course. Jason's threats were far from over. And if he decided to go all in on his accusations, a recording of him making threats might not be enough to clear our names. It would be our word against his. And with his ability to manipulate the narrative, I knew we couldn't afford to take any chances. We spent the next few days trying to keep a low profile, going about our routines as if nothing had changed, but I could feel the tension simmering between us. Emily and I barely spoke, both of us too afraid to bring up the confrontation at the diner or the violence that had erupted between us and Jason. But I couldn't stay passive forever. My anger at Jason's threats and my desperation to protect Emily kept bubbling to the surface, driving me to take a risk that I knew could backfire. I reached out to an old friend of mine, a lawyer named Sam who specialized in civil disputes. I didn't give him the full details, just enough to let him know that someone was threatening Emily with false accusations. Sam's response was cautious but hopeful. "If you've got evidence that he's been threatening her, you might have a case for harassment, maybe even extortion. But you need to be prepared for a fight, Ryan. Guys like this, they don't back down easily." I thanked him and hung up, feeling a little more hopeful. But when I told Emily about my conversation with Sam, she grew tense, pacing back and forth across our living room like a caged animal. "You shouldn't have involved him," she said, her voice sharp. "If Jason finds out we're going after him legally, he'll escalate. He won't just threaten us, he'll destroy us." I tried to keep my frustration in check, but I couldn't help the edge in my voice. "We can't keep running scared, Emily. We have to take a stand at some point, or he's going to keep holding this over us forever." She stopped pacing, turning to face me with a look that cut straight through me. "You don't understand, Ryan. If we push him too hard, if he feels cornered, he'll do something reckless. You saw what he's capable of at the diner. He won't let us walk away from this." For a moment, we stared at each other, the distance between us yawning wider than ever. I saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had driven her to keep so many secrets from me. And for the first time, I wondered if she was right, if we were walking into a trap of our own making. A few nights later, everything came crashing down. It was late when the phone rang, jolting me out of a restless sleep. I reached for it, groggily checking the caller ID, and felt a jolt of dread when I saw Jason's name flashing on the screen. I answered it, trying to keep my voice steady. "Jason, what do you want?" His voice crackled through the line, rough and slurred like he'd been drinking. "You thought you could pull one over on me, didn't you, Ryan? Thought you could record me and scare me off." I sat up, tension flooding my body. "You should think about what you're saying, Jason. We have you on tape threatening Emily. You can't win this." He let out a bitter laugh that sent a chill down my spine. "You think that little tape is going to save you? I've got more dirt on Emily than you could ever imagine. And I just sent a little package to your lawyer friend. Thought he might like to see what really happened to Lucas." My blood ran cold as the implications sank in. If Jason had sent evidence to Sam, then he was taking this to the next level, trying to make sure we couldn't fight back. And if he had gone this far, it meant he was ready to burn everything down around him, including us. I got out of bed, pacing the room as I tried to think. "Jason, listen to me." "No, you listen," he snapped, his tone shifting from anger to something more dangerous. "Meet me at the construction site near the old mill. Tonight. Come alone. If you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows what Emily did. And believe me, Ryan, she won't be the only one who loses everything." Before I could respond, the line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone in disbelief. I turned to find Emily standing in the doorway, her face pale with fear. She had heard everything. "You can't go, Ryan," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He's trying to bait you. He's trying to make sure you're alone, so he can." I crossed the room and took her hands in mine, squeezing them tightly. "We don't have a choice. He's going to keep pushing until one of us breaks. But if I can talk him down, if I can get him to see reason." "He's not reasonable," she interrupted, her voice rising with desperation. "You don't know him like I do, Ryan. He won't stop until he gets what he wants." I looked into her eyes, seeing the tears gathering there, and I felt something break inside me. I knew she was right. Knew that Jason was beyond reason, beyond any hope of negotiation. But I couldn't let her face this alone. I couldn't let him tear apart the last pieces of our lives. "I have to try, Emily," I said softly. "It's the only way." She pulled away from me, wrapping her arms around herself, as if she was trying to hold herself together. For a moment, I thought she might try to stop me, but then she nodded, a broken look in her eyes. "Okay, just promise me you'll come back." I kissed her forehead, feeling the weight of her fears settle over me like a shroud. "I promise." I arrived at the construction site just after midnight, the skeletal frame of a half-finished building looming against the night sky. The wind howled through the empty windows, sending loose tarps flapping like ghostly wings. My footsteps echoed across the gravel as I walked deeper into the shadows, my pulse quickening with each step. Jason was waiting for me near the back of the building, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a manila envelope in the other. He looked disheveled, his clothes rumpled, his eyes bloodshot. He smiled when he saw me, but there was no warmth in it. "You're a brave man, Ryan," he said, taking a swig from the bottle. "Or maybe just a stupid one." I kept my distance, my hands clenched into fists. "You've made your point, Jason, but it doesn't have to end this way. You can walk away." He scoffed, tossing the envelope onto the ground between us. "Walk away? After everything she did to me? Everything she let happen to that boy? No, I'm not going anywhere until she pays." I glanced down at the envelope, knowing that inside it was the evidence he'd gathered. Letters from Lucas, statements from witnesses who'd seen Emily that night. It was enough to destroy her, to ruin both of us if it ever saw the light of day. But I couldn't let him win. I couldn't let him drag us down with him. "You don't have to do this, Jason," I said, my voice steady. "You've already made her suffer enough." Jason's smile twisted into something cruel. "You think I care about making her suffer? This isn't about her anymore. It's about you, Ryan. You think you can save her, but you can't even save yourself." Before I could react, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a pistol, leveling it at my chest. My heart leapt into my throat, but I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my hands visible. "Jason, put the gun down," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We don't have to." He cut me off, his voice cracking with anger. "I should have done this a long time ago, back when she threw me away like I was nothing. But now you get to pay the price, Ryan. Both of you do." He tightened his grip on the gun, and I braced myself for the worst. But before he could pull the trigger, a voice rang out through the night, a voice that sent a jolt through both of us. "Jason, stop!" I turned to see Emily standing at the edge of the shadows, her face pale but determined. She had followed me, ignoring my warning to stay behind. And now, she was staring down Jason with a look of defiance I hadn't seen in years. Jason's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, his grip on the gun wavered. "Emily, what the hell are you doing here?" She stepped forward, her hands raised. "You want to hurt me? Fine, but leave Ryan out of this. I'll do whatever you want. Just let him go." The air crackled with tension, and I could see the indecision in Jason's eyes. He hesitated, his hand shaking, and in that split second, I knew I had to act. I lunged forward, grabbing his wrist and twisting it upward. The gun went off, the shot echoing through the construction site, but I managed to wrench it from his grip. He stumbled back, clutching his wrist, his face twisted in pain and rage. Emily rushed to my side, her hands trembling as she touched my shoulder. "Ryan, are you okay?" I nodded, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. But as I looked down at Jason, clutching his wounded wrist, I knew that the real danger was far from over. The gunshot echoed through the empty construction site, ringing in my ears long after the sound had faded. I stood over Jason, my chest heaving as adrenaline coursed through my veins. He lay on the gravel, clutching his wrist where I'd twisted it, his face twisted in pain. Emily clung to my arm, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. For a moment, everything was still, the night air thick with the scent of dust and sweat. Then Jason's expression shifted, turning from pain to a bitter, vengeful smirk. "You think this changes anything, Ryan?" he rasped, his voice barely more than a growl. "You think you've won? I still have the letters. I still have witnesses. Even if you drag me to the police, they'll believe me. I'll make sure you both go down with me." I stared down at him, feeling the cold weight of the gun in my hand. He wasn't wrong. He still had enough leverage to ruin us, to turn the investigation into a nightmare that could tear our lives apart. But the rage I'd felt earlier was fading, replaced by a sick, hollow feeling. I couldn't bring myself to use the gun, couldn't cross that final line, even for Emily's sake. But Emily had no such hesitation. She stepped forward, pulling free of my grip, and looked down at Jason with a cold, steely gaze that I hadn't seen before. There was no fear in her eyes now, only a grim determination. "You want to destroy me, Jason? Fine, but I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said, her voice steady, though I could hear the tremor just beneath the surface. "You think you can use those letters to hurt me? Go ahead. I'll take my chances. But if you come after Ryan again, I swear, I'll make sure you pay for every threat you've ever made." Jason laughed, a rough, broken sound that echoed in the dark. "You're bluffing, Emily. You're too scared to do what needs to be done." She crouched down, meeting his gaze, her expression unflinching. "You're right, I've been scared for a long time. But I'm done letting you control me. You don't get to win anymore." The tension between them crackled like electricity, and I held my breath, wondering if Jason would try to lunge at her again, if he'd push her to the breaking point. But then his shoulders sagged, and he let out a shaky breath, his eyes darkening with a mix of frustration and something almost like defeat. "Fine, Emily. You win this round," he muttered, his voice raw with bitterness. "But you'll never be free of this." "Not really." Emily straightened, glancing back at me, her expression unreadable. "Come on, Ryan. Let's go. We're done here." I hesitated, looking between her and Jason, still sprawled on the ground. My mind raced with 1,000 questions, doubts that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. But I knew that there was no turning back now, no way to untangle the mess we'd become part of. I tucked the gun into my jacket and followed Emily out of the construction site, leaving Jason behind in the shadows. We drove back home in silence, the tension between us as thick as the darkness outside. When we finally pulled into the driveway, Emily stayed in the car, staring out the windshield with a distant look in her eyes. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. She turned to me, her expression softening for a moment, and I caught a glimpse of the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "Now we try to move on, Ryan. We try to forget." I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't ignore the weight of everything that still hung between us. Jason's threats, the secrets we'd uncovered, the violence that had almost consumed us. I nodded, forcing myself to smile, but I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, I woke to find Emily already up, pacing the living room with her phone in her hand. She froze when she saw me, quickly shoving the phone into her pocket, but I caught the tension in her expression before she could hide it. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Did something happen?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "It's nothing, just some calls I need to make. I'm trying to make sure Jason won't be able to hurt us anymore." I frowned, suspicion curling in my gut. "What kind of calls?" She looked away, her jaw tightening. "I'm handling it, Ryan. Trust me." But trust was a fragile thing between us now, and her evasiveness only deepened the unease that had been growing inside me. I watched as she disappeared into the backyard, speaking in hushed tones into her phone, and I knew that whatever she was planning, she didn't want me involved. A few days later, I found out why. I came home from work to find a letter waiting for me on the kitchen table, sealed in a plain, white envelope with no return address. Inside was a brief, typed note. The evidence is gone. Jason won't be a problem anymore. Don't look for him. This is your last chance to move on, Ryan. Take it. The words sent a chill down my spine, and I rushed to find Emily, my mind spinning with questions. I found her in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed with a faraway look in her eyes. When she saw the letter in my hand, she closed her eyes, letting out a shaky breath. "What did you do, Emily?" I demanded, my voice cracking with the weight of my fear. She looked up at me, her expression cold and resolute. "I did what I had to do, Ryan. Jason won't be able to use those letters or those witnesses against us anymore. He won't hurt us again." I stared at her, horror creeping into my chest. "What do you mean he won't hurt us again? Where is he?" She shook her head, her face pale but determined. "It's better if you don't know. It's better if we both forget." My mind raced, trying to make sense of her words, but the implications were impossible to ignore. She had crossed a line, one that I hadn't been willing to cross, and now we were both trapped in the consequences of her choices. I wanted to believe that Jason had simply left town, that he'd given up on his threats, but the dark edge in her voice told me otherwise. Did you have something to do with him disappearing?" I whispered, my hands trembling. She didn't answer, just looked down at her hands, her silence saying more than any confession could. We spent the next few weeks living in a fragile peace, both of us pretending that the danger had passed, that we could still find a way back to the life we'd once shared. But the silence between us grew heavier with each passing day, filled with unspoken questions and the shadow of Jason's absence. I tried to convince myself that I could live with it, that I could accept whatever Emily had done to keep us safe. But every time I looked at her, I saw the distance in her eyes, the wall she had built between us to protect her secrets. And every time I closed my eyes, I heard Jason's voice, echoing with the promise that the truth would never fully disappear. Months later, the police came knocking. They asked about Jason, about the last time we'd seen him. I kept my answers vague, trying to play the role of the concerned friend who hadn't seen him in months. But I knew they were suspicious. They knew about the conflict between us and the way Jason had been asking questions about Emily. Emily stayed calm through the questioning, but I could see the fear lurking just beneath her composed surface. She was good at hiding it, better than I was, but I knew her too well. I saw the way her hands shook when she thought I wasn't looking, the way she flinched whenever the phone rang. After the police left, I found her sitting in the backyard, staring out at the setting sun. I joined her, the silence stretching between us like an unbridgeable chasm. "They're not going to let this go," I said finally, my voice raw with the weight of our choices. "They're going to keep looking." She nodded, her face expressionless. "Then we'll keep lying. We'll do whatever we have to." I looked at her, seeing the woman I had once loved, the woman who had become a stranger to me. And I realized that no matter how much we tried to bury the past, it would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface. A year passed, and the questions about Jason's disappearance began to fade, replaced by new rumors and new scandals. But the shadow of that night never left us. It lingered in every glance, every forced smile, every moment of silence between us. Emily and I stayed together, bound by the secrets we shared, but the trust that had once held us together was gone. We moved to a new town, started over, but the ghosts of our choices followed us, haunting every corner of our lives. I kept the letter Jason had sent me hidden away, buried at the back of a drawer, a reminder of the darkness we had embraced to survive. Some nights, I would take it out and read it again, wondering if I'd ever have the courage to confront Emily with the truth, if I'd ever find the strength to leave behind the life we had built on lies. But in the end, I knew that the real question wasn't whether I could trust her again. It was whether I could trust myself to live with what we had become.